my 30th birthday, my parents withdrew $2.3 million that I saved, but they fell into my traffic. My name is Emma. I'm 30 years old. On my birthday this year, my parents walked into a bank using forged documents and drained $2.3 million from what they thought was my life savings. They smirked, thinking they'd secured my sister's future. But they didn't know I had planned this exact trap for 3 years, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. My life as a ghost began the day I turned 20. That wasn't just the day I got my first real job. It was the day I became a line item in my father's budget. I'd spent 2 years earning a pharmacy technician certification, and the county hospital hired me a week after I graduated. The job was demanding, a blur of counting pills, verifying prescriptions, and dealing with people who were often sick, impatient, and scared. But it was real work. It was important, and it came with a real paycheck. I remember that first one vividly. I picked it up from the HR department on a Friday afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. I didn't open the envelope right away. I held it in my hands, feeling the crisp edges, the slight weight of the check inside. It felt like a key. I sat in my beat-up 15-year-old sedan, the one I'd bought with money from my high school job, and I let myself dream for a moment. I imagined saving up, putting a down payment on a tiny apartment, a place that was only mine, a place where I could be messy if I wanted, where I could eat cereal for dinner without my mother's sigh of disapproval, a place that was quiet. The dream carried me all the way home. When I walked through the door, the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. It was my favorite. My mom only made it on special occasions. For a naive moment, I thought she had made it for me to celebrate my first paycheck. "Emma, in the kitchen," my father's voice called out. It had a formal, commanding tone that immediately put me on edge. The warmth of my dream began to fade. He was sitting at the head of the kitchen table. It was his throne. In front of him was a black, hardbound ledger book and a sleek silver calculator. He looked like a tax auditor preparing for a corporate raid. My mother was at the stove, her back to me, fussing with the roasting pan. She was his silent, ever-present accomplice. Her silence was her consent. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the chair opposite him. It felt like an interrogation. I sat, placing the unopened envelope on the table between us. "You received your first paycheck," he stated. It was not a question. A cold knot formed in my stomach. "I did," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "I was just about to open it?" "No need," he said, tapping a piece of paper next to his ledger. "I called your payroll department this morning to confirm the amount. Your gross pay is $1,100. After taxes, your net pay is $912.41. The words hung in the air. He had called my job. He had gone behind my back and asked for my private financial information. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger. "Why would you do that?" I asked. "That's my information." He looked at me then, and his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a manager assessing an asset. "This is a family, Emma, and in this family we are a single economic unit. Your earnings belong to the household. We support each other. We have raised you, fed you, and put a roof over your head. Now it is your turn to contribute." He opened the ledger. On the first page, in his precise all-caps handwriting, it said, "Emma, Family Contribution System." He then slid the piece of paper towards me. It was a typed-out document, a list of rules. My rules. It stated that 80% of my net income, from any and all sources, was to be turned over to the family. He had already done the math for my first check. My contribution was $729.93. I was allowed to keep $182.48 for myself. He had highlighted this number in yellow, as if it were a generous gift. "This will cover your room and board, your utilities, and your share of the family expenses," he explained, his voice clinical. "The remainder will go toward the household budget, which primarily involves ensuring your sister has every opportunity to succeed. Lily is gifted. She requires significant investment." Lily, my younger sister, was a freshman in high school. She was the center of their universe. She was beautiful, charming, and effortlessly popular. She was everything I wasn't. My parents saw her as a masterpiece, and I was just the scaffolding they used to build her up. I looked at my mother, hoping for some sign of support, some flicker of maternal protection. She finally turned from the stove, a practiced, weary smile on her face. "It's how a family works, honey," she said softly. "We all have to sacrifice. It's your turn to help your little sister. Sacrifice." That word would come to define the next 10 years of my life. I didn't argue. I knew it was useless. I had been raised in a house where my father's word was law, and my mother was his enforcer. I just nodded, my throat tight. He pushed a pen toward me. "Sign here," he said, pointing to the bottom of the rule sheet. "To acknowledge you understand." I signed. The contract for my own indentured servitude. My life immediately shrank. The dream of my own apartment evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of my spreadsheets. I took on a second job stocking shelves at a grocery store, a brutal midnight to 6 a.m. shift. I would finish at the pharmacy at 10 p.m., my legs and back aching from standing all day, and drive to the grocery store. The fluorescent lights hummed over my head as I lifted heavy boxes, my body screaming for sleep. I was fueled by cheap, bitter coffee from the break room vending machine. I'd get home just as the sun was rising, crawl into bed for 4 hours, and then wake up to the sound of my alarm, my bones feeling like they were filled with sand. My father, of course, discovered the second job within a month. He saw the extra deposit in my bank account, the one he monitored online. There was no praise for my work ethic, no concern for my health. There was only another meeting at the kitchen table. He opened the ledger and adjusted the numbers. My contribution simply went up. While my world was gray and exhausting, Lily's was a kaleidoscope of vibrant color. On her 16th birthday, my parents threw a huge party in the backyard. I had to work a double shift that day to help pay for the caterer. I got home just as my father was leading Lily to the driveway with his hands over her eyes. A brand new red convertible sat at the curb, a giant white bow on the hood. Lily screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She jumped into my father's arms. My mother wept with happiness. My contribution had paid for every nut and bolt of that car. Standing at the edge of the party, in my wrinkled scrubs smelling of antiseptic, I felt utterly invisible. I was a ghost at my own family's celebration. Her life was a highlight reel I was forced to fund. Spring break in Cancun with her friends. I saw the photos on Instagram. Lily in a bikini, laughing on a boat, a turquoise ocean behind her. That week, I had been surviving on instant noodles because I'd had to buy new work shoes, and the expense had wiped out my personal funds for the month. I looked at the picture on my tiny, cracked phone screen while sitting in my cold car, and the injustice was a physical pain, a sharp stone in my gut. Family dinners were a special kind of torture. Lily would dominate the conversation, talking about sorority drama, a professor she didn't like, or a new pair of boots she desperately needed. My parents would listen, enraptured, offering advice and reassurance. Then my father would turn to me, his gaze flat and dismissive. "Emma, the lawn needs mowing this weekend." Or my mother would say, without looking at me, "Emma, can you clear the table? I want to show Lily the brochure for her summer program in Spain." They never asked about my day. They never asked about the elderly woman who cried on my shoulder at the pharmacy because she couldn't afford her heart medication. They never asked about the exhaustion I felt so deep in my bones that I was afraid I might never feel rested again. I wasn't a person with a life and feelings. I was a resource. I was the family's private ATM, and my PIN number was their love for my sister. And every day I felt myself hardening, the soft parts of me turning to stone in self-defense. The cold, quiet anger in my heart was no longer a seed. It was a root, twisting and growing stronger in the dark. The rebellion didn't start with a shout. It started with a whisper, with the crinkle of a $5 bill. I was 22, and my life had been a monotonous cycle of work and sleep for 2 solid years. I was running on fumes, a hollowed-out version of my former self. To escape the suffocating atmosphere at home, I'd picked up a third job, waiting tables at a greasy spoon diner on Saturday and Sunday mornings. I told my parents I had joined a volunteer group at the hospital that required early weekend hours. They accepted the lie without a second thought. It fit their narrative of their dutiful, boring daughter. The diner was dingy. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and bacon fat, and the vinyl on the booth seats was cracked and peeling. But the work was simple, and more importantly, some of the customers paid their checks in cash and left tips on the table. For the first few weeks, I dutifully declared my cash tips and deposited them into my official bank account. My father would note the increase and adjust my contribution accordingly. I was still trapped. Then one Saturday, a kind-looking older man I'd served coffee to left a $5 bill tucked under his saucer. I picked it up. The paper was soft and worn. I stood there for a moment in the busy diner, the sounds of clattering dishes and conversation fading into the background. A thought, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of my exhaustion. He gave this to me. Not to the family. To me. Instead of putting it in the register pouch with the rest of my tips, I folded it neatly and slid it into the pocket of my jeans. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt monumental. It was the first dollar I had earned in 2 years that my father would not know about, could not calculate, and could not take. It felt like a spark in a dark room. That single $5 bill became my secret. It was joined by another, then a 10, then a 20. I became meticulous about it. I would separate my cash tips, declaring just enough to avoid suspicion and pocketing the rest. I found a loose brick in the back of my bedroom closet. I'd wrapped my growing stash of cash in a plastic bag and hidden it in the hollow space. Every night, before I collapsed into bed, I'd perform a small ritual. I would pull out the brick, add the day's secret earnings, and count the total. Watching the pile of cash grow was the only thing that made me feel like I had any control over my own life. It was proof that a small part of me was still mine. When the hidden stash reached $1,000, I knew I couldn't keep that much cash in the house. The fear of my parents finding it was constant. I started planning my next move with the precision of a military strategist. I researched banks in neighboring counties, looking for a place where I was unlikely to ever run into anyone I knew. I settled on a small, unassuming credit union in a town 50 miles away. One Tuesday, my official day off between my 2 main jobs, I told my parents I was going to the library to study for a pharmacy recertification exam. Instead, I got in my car and drove for an hour, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I felt like a spy on a secret mission. I walked into the credit union, my hands clammy. The woman who helped me was named Linda. She had a warm smile and pictures of her grandchildren on her desk. She didn't ask any probing questions. She just helped me open a simple savings account and a P.O. box to receive the statements. I deposited $900, all in wrinkled 10s and 20s from the diner. Walking out of that bank, I felt a sense of power I had never known. I had a secret. I had a life that was completely separate from my family. That account became my sanctuary. It was the only place where I was truly free. The secret life fueled me. I found an online ad for a small construction company that needed a freelance bookkeeper. I applied and got the job. I told my parents my volunteer work was now requiring me to do data entry from home. They just shrugged. My nights were now even longer. After my shift at the grocery store, I would come home, turn on my laptop, and work for another 3 hours, reconciling invoices and tracking expenses. But this work was different. Every dollar I earned went directly into my hidden account. The numbers on my secret online banking portal climbed steadily. 50,000, 100,000, $250,000. That number became my lifeline, my silent promise to myself that one day I would be free. By the time I was 25, I was promoted to lead pharmacy technician. It was a significant career step, and it came with a massive pay raise, nearly doubling my official salary. For a fleeting moment, I felt a surge of professional pride. Then the dread set in. I knew what was coming. A week later, I was summoned to the kitchen table. The black ledger was waiting. "Emma," my father began, a thin, predatory smile on his face. "I saw your latest pay stub. Your promotion is very impressive. Your mother and I are proud." It was the first time he'd ever said that word to me. It tasted like ash. "Thank you, Dad," I said, keeping my face neutral. "Your new gross monthly salary is $5,200, he continued, already tapping numbers into his calculator. "After taxes, that will give us a much-needed boost for the family budget. Lily's tuition is going up next semester, you know." He didn't even pretend it was for anything else. My success was a direct pipeline to funding my sister's life. He turned the ledger around. "Your new monthly contribution will be $4,160. We'll let you keep the rest. Don't spend it all in one place." He chuckled at his own joke. I felt a cold rage settle deep in my bones. I had worked so hard for that promotion. I had stayed late, taken on extra responsibilities, and proven myself to be the best technician in the department, and my reward was to have my chains pulled tighter. I just nodded. I understand. But as I walked away from the table, I wasn't defeated. I was motivated. Their greed was predictable. It was a force of nature, like gravity, and I could use it against them. That night, after a brutal 13-hour workday, I came home, logged into my freelance bookkeeping account, and finished a project for a client. The payment was $2,000. I transferred every penny of it into my hidden account. The balance ticked past $850,000. They could have their 80% of the life they knew about. I would keep 100% of the life they didn't. Every time they tightened their grip, they were just teaching me how to be better at slipping through their fingers. The pivot point, the moment my passive defense turned into a cold-blooded offensive, arrived on a dreary, rain-soaked Tuesday when I was 27. It wasn't a loud confrontation or a dramatic confession. It was the quiet rustle of paper in a dusty office that revealed the true chilling nature of my family's plans for me. My mother had adopted a new tactic of masking her demands as compliments. "Emma, sweetie, you're just so good at organizing," she'd said that morning, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your father's office is an absolute disaster zone, and I can't find the warranty for the new washing machine anywhere. Could you possibly sort through it for me?" It was a command disguised as a request, a classic move in her manipulation playbook. So I spent my day off in my father's home office. The room was his sanctuary, a testament to his obsession with control. Books were arranged by color and size, pens were aligned in perfect parallel, and every file in his cabinet was meticulously labeled. But in the corner was a large cardboard box overflowing with old, unsorted paperwork, the task he'd deemed beneath him. It was my job to sift through the chaos he allowed to exist. I put on some music and began the mind-numbing task of sorting years of accumulated paper. There were old tax returns, car repair receipts from a decade ago, manuals for appliances we no longer owned, and travel brochures for vacations I was never invited on. It was a paper trail of a family life I had only witnessed from the outside. After an hour, my fingers dusty and my back starting to ache, I pulled out a plain manila folder that was heavier than the others. It was wedged between a file for vacation itineraries 2005-2010 and household warranties. On the tab, written in my father's precise architectural block letters, was my name, Emma. A jolt went through me. My name, in his private filing system. My first thought was that it must be sentimental. Maybe old report cards, drawings from kindergarten, things a normal father might keep. I opened it with a sense of cautious curiosity. The contents stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't sentimental. It was clinical. It was an arsenal. On top was a pristine high-resolution photocopy of my birth certificate. Beneath that, a copy of my social security card, both the front and the back. Then came a neatly typed list of every official job I had ever had, complete with the names of my supervisors, my salary at each position, and the dates of my employment. There were bank statements from my official checking account going back 7 years, the one he monitored, and at the very bottom was a clear color copy of my driver's license. I sank to the floor, the folder in my lap. My hands were trembling. This was not a collection of memories. This was an identity theft kit. He had gathered every piece of documentation one would need to impersonate me, to take out loans in my name, to access my accounts, to become me on paper. The meticulous, organized nature of it was what scared me the most. This wasn't a random collection of papers. It was a deliberately assembled file. It was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at me. For weeks after that discovery, I lived in a state of quiet paranoia. I saw everything through a new, sinister lens. When my mother would ask casual questions about my work schedule, I no longer heard motherly interest. I heard an intelligence officer gathering information. When my father would advise me to consolidate my savings for a better interest rate, I didn't hear financial advice. I heard a thief telling me where to pile the loot for easier collection, but I still didn't know the specifics of their plan. I had the how, but I didn't have the what or the when. The final devastating piece of the puzzle was laid bare on the 4th of July. The whole extended family was over for a backyard barbecue. The air smelled of charcoal and freshly cut grass. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, cornered me by the drink cooler. She was a kind but tragically indiscreet woman, especially after 2 glasses of rosé. "Emma, there you are," she said, her voice a little too loud. She slung a warm arm around my shoulders. "I was just telling your mother. It's just so incredible what you're doing. We're all so proud," I tensed. "Doing what?" "You know, for Lily," she said with a wide conspiratorial grin, helping her with her dream. "A doctor. My niece is going to be a doctor. It's all anyone can talk about." I just nodded, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. She leaned closer, her breath smelling of wine. "And honestly, it's so generous of you. Your parents told me the whole plan. Med school is just insanely expensive, but they said it's all taken care of. That private 6-year program Lily wants is nearly $2 million. But they told me not to worry, because your savings will cover all of it. They said they'll be taking care of the transfer right around your 30th birthday. It's like a gift to the whole family." The world went silent. The cheerful sounds of the party, the laughter, the music, the distant pop of a firecracker, all faded into a single high-pitched ringing in my ears. My savings. A transfer. My 30th birthday. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. The file, the questions, the years of financial servitude. It was all a lead-up to a single grand act of theft. They weren't just taking my income. They were planning to liquidate my entire life's work, everything I had bled for, and hand it over to my sister. And they were going to do it on my birthday. The cruelty of that detail was breathtaking. They were going to celebrate the day of my birth by erasing my future. I mumbled an excuse and stumbled away, making my way to the downstairs bathroom. I locked the door and gripped the sides of the sink, staring at my reflection. The face that looked back was a stranger, a pale, wide-eyed woman whose life was a lie. The girl who had once craved her parents' love was gone forever. She had died in that moment by the drink cooler. In her place was someone else, someone cold and sharp. I looked into my own eyes in the mirror and saw not a victim, but a strategist. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had spent 27 years treating me like an emotionless, obedient machine, a simple tool for their use. They had no idea that in doing so they had stripped away all the soft, forgiving parts of me. They had left behind only gears and logic. And my logical conclusion was this: a trap must be set. The finality of the decision was calming. The fear and hurt were burned away by the cold fire of purpose. They had started a war. I was going to end it. In the aftermath of the 4th of July barbecue, the emotional turmoil within me settled into a state of hyper-focused calm. The pain was still there, a dense, cold stone in my chest, but I built a wall of pure logic around it. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. My energy was now a resource to be allocated, and every ounce of it would be dedicated to the construction of a perfect, inescapable trap. My 30th birthday was my deadline. That gave me just under 3 years. My public persona remained unchanged. I was still Emma, the quiet, tireless daughter. I worked my shifts. I paid my 80% contribution without complaint. I nodded meekly during my father's financial lectures. This performance was the most critical element of my plan. My camouflage had to be flawless. While they saw the sheep, I was becoming the wolf. My evenings, once dedicated to exhaustion or the numb escape of television, were now spent in clandestine study. At the public library or on a privacy-screened laptop late at night, I became an obsessive student of my enemy's tactics. I read everything I could find about identity theft, wire fraud, and banking security protocols. I learned the ways people forge documents, the loopholes they exploit, and the mistakes they make. I was reverse engineering their future crimes so I could build a cage tailored to its exact dimensions. The first phase of the plan was to construct the bait. They needed a target, a big, juicy account that would make their mouths water and cloud their judgment. I went to a large, well-known national bank, the kind that advertises heavily and has branches in every shopping mall. It was the opposite of the discreet credit union where my real money was hidden. I opened a high-yield savings account. This would be my decoy. For the next 30 months, I orchestrated a complex financial ballet. My goal was to create a history of rapid, believable growth in this bait account. I took out a series of rotating, short-term personal loans online. The process was nerve-wracking at first. I'd apply for a $30,000 loan, and when it was approved, the funds would be deposited directly into the bait account. It would sit there for 30 days, just long enough to be recorded on a monthly bank statement. I would download the statement, a beautiful document showing a healthy balance. Then, before the first significant interest payment was due, I would pay back the entire loan using funds from a new, slightly larger loan from a different lender. It was a high-wire act of leveraging debt to create the illusion of wealth, a sophisticated shell game played with digital money. Alongside the loan rotation, I funneled a small, consistent portion of my bookkeeping income into the account, just enough to create a plausible narrative of a diligent saver. I wanted the paper trail to be perfect. My technical skills grew. I learned to use sophisticated software to edit the PDF bank statements I downloaded. I'd carefully alter the numbers, inflating the balance by a few $1,000s each month, making my savings rate seem almost superhuman. It was these forged statements that I would strategically leave behind for my parents to find. I'd leave one on the printer tray, forget one on the kitchen counter, or let one poke out of my purse. I'll never forget the first time I saw my father take the bait. I had left an altered statement on the mail table. From the crack of my bedroom door, I watched him pick it up. He thought he was alone. He studied the paper, his eyes scanning the numbers. I saw his eyebrows raise. A small, smug smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a con man who thinks his mark is a fool. He folded the paper neatly and put it in his pocket. He was hooked. While I was building the decoy, I was fortifying my real assets. My actual life savings, which had now grown past the $2 million mark, were in a professionally managed trust account. I had a meeting with the trust manager, a serious woman in her 50s named Ms. Albright, explained that I needed the account to be placed under the highest possible security protocols due to a sensitive family situation. She understood immediately. We set up a system that required a physical security key, a small device that generated a new code every 60 seconds, as well as a verbal password and confirmation calls for any transaction over $500. My life's work was now housed in a digital Fort Knox. It was completely untouchable. The final piece of the trap was to ensure my parents had the key, but only to the empty treasure chest. I went online to the Bait Accounts portal. I knew from my research that my mother occasionally tried to guess my passwords. I intentionally changed the password to something insultingly simple, Lily Med School 2025. Then, I updated the security questions to answers my parents would undoubtedly know. What was the name of your first pet? Fluffy, the cat Lily had begged for. What is your mother's maiden name? It was like leaving the key under the doormat. I was inviting them in. Living this double life for 3 years was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. Every family dinner was a performance. Every polite conversation was filled with subtext. I had to smile at my mother as she gushed about Lily's bright future, all the while knowing she was planning to finance that future with my stolen money. I had to listen to my father's empty praise about my responsibility, knowing he saw me as nothing more than a fattened pig ready for market. There were nights I would lie in bed, the loneliness a crushing weight, and I would ask myself if it was worth it. The anger was a constant low-grade fever, and it was exhausting to maintain. In those moments of doubt, I would pull out the manila folder I had stolen back from my father's office. I had it hidden with my secret cash reserve inside the wall. I would look at the cold, bureaucratic copies of my life. I would remember the smug smile on my father's face. I would remember my aunt's cheerful voice sealing my fate at a family barbecue. And my resolve would harden like steel. They had shown me who they were. I was about to show them who I had become. My 30th birthday was approaching. The countdown had begun. The morning of my 30th birthday began with silence. It was a heavy, deliberate silence, the kind that speaks louder than any words. For my entire life, my birthday had been a non-event, a minor inconvenience in the calendar of the family's life, which revolved entirely around Lily. But there was always at least a perfunctory, "Happy birthday, Emma," from my mother as she rushed out the door, or a grunt of acknowledgement from my father from behind his newspaper. This year, there was nothing. I came downstairs at 7 a.m. to get ready for my shift at the pharmacy. My mother was in the kitchen, carefully measuring coffee grounds into the filter, her movements precise and contained. She didn't look up. My father was at the table, already dressed, reading the financial news on his tablet. He didn't lift his eyes from the screen. It was as if I were a ghost, a specter in my own home on the day of my birth. A part of me, the small, stupid, hopeful child that I thought had died years ago, felt a familiar pang of hurt. But the strategist, the woman I had become, recognized the silence for what it was, the quiet before a storm. This was their game face. This was the day they had been planning for, and their lack of acknowledgement was part of their justification. You don't have to wish a happy birthday to a bank account you are about to empty. I'm leaving for work, I said into the silence. My mother finally looked at me, her expression unreadable. Have a good day, dear, she said, her voice flat. It was the same tone she used when speaking to the mailman. My father said nothing. As I drove to work, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The anticipation that had been a constant hum beneath my skin for 3 years was finally solidifying into reality. I had built the stage, set the props, and written the script. All I had to do now was let the actors play their parts. The day at the pharmacy was excruciatingly normal. Mrs. Henderson came in to pick up her blood pressure medication and complained about the weather. Mr. Gable needed help finding the right kind of bandages for his knee. A young mother tried to wrangle her 2 screaming toddlers while I filled a prescription for amoxicillin. I moved on autopilot, my hands counting pills, my mouth explaining dosages, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time my phone buzzed in my pocket, my heart leaped into my throat. I checked it during my lunch break. Nothing. Just a few automated emails and a text from my cell provider. I ate my sad desk lunch of a squashed sandwich and an apple, the food tasting like cardboard. Had I miscalculated? Had they changed their minds? A sliver of doubt crept in, a terrifying thought that my 3-year ordeal of planning might have been for nothing. But then I thought of the look in my father's eyes that morning, the cold transactional focus. No, I hadn't miscalculated. They were just waiting for the right time. The afternoon dragged on. At 2:15 p.m., I was helping an elderly man named George. He was a sweet man, a widower who came in every month and always told me stories about his late wife, Eleanor. He was telling me about the prize-winning roses she used to grow when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It wasn't a short buzz of a text message. It was a longer, more insistent vibration, the kind I had customized for my banking alerts. My breath caught in my chest. George was still talking about peonies and soil acidity. I tried to focus on his face, to nod and smile, but the phone in my pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "That's just wonderful, George," I managed to say, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I finished ringing up his purchase, my hands feeling clumsy and disconnected from my body. "You have a good day now." "Emma?" he said with a kind smile. "You too?" "George." The moment he was out the door, I pulled out my phone, my thumb shaking as I unlocked the screen. And there it was, an email and a text message from the Bait Accounts Bank. The subject line was stark and simple: large withdrawal notification. I opened it. The text was blunt, factual, and utterly devastating in its clarity. A withdrawal of $2,340,000 from your savings. Account ending in 4591 has been processed at 2:19 p.m. EST at the downtown branch location. Your new balance is $1,321.14 down. I stared at the numbers. $2,340,000. They had taken everything. Every fake loan, every doctored statement, every penny of the fictional fortune I had built for them to find. They had left me with just over $1,000, perhaps as a final cruel joke. My vision tunneled. The sounds of the pharmacy, the beeping scanner, the quiet chatter, the ringing phone, faded into a dull roar. I dropped the bottle of vitamins I was holding. It clattered to the floor, spilling bright yellow pills across the white linoleum like scattered teeth. "Emma, are you okay?" My manager, Carlos, was looking at me with concern. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, holding up my phone as if it were the scene of a crime. I felt a wave of dizziness. They really did it. The bastards really truly did it. The confirmation was horrifying, but beneath the horror was a grim, dark, cold satisfaction. The trap had been sprung. "I have to go," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Family emergency." I didn't wait for his response. I threw my lab coat on the counter and practically ran out of the pharmacy, ignoring the confused calls of my coworkers. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands refusing to obey. The short drive home felt like an eternity. The streets were filled with people living their normal lives, laughing, talking on their phones, walking their dogs. They had no idea that my world had just cracked open. My mind was racing. They were so arrogant. They had done it in person, at a branch, in the middle of a weekday. They must have been so sure of themselves, so confident in their forgeries and their entitlement, that they felt untouchable. I pulled into the driveway, my tires screeching slightly. The house looked exactly the same, peaceful, normal. It was sickening. I took a deep breath, schooling my features into a mask of frantic worry, the part I was now meant to play. I burst through the front door. Mom, Dad, and there they were, in the living room. My mother was sitting in her favorite armchair, sipping a cup of tea, a delicate floral cup she only used for special occasions. Her pinky finger was extended. My father was on the sofa, his newspaper open, his feet propped up on the coffee table. The scene was a perfect picture of tranquil domesticity. It was the most obscene thing I had ever witnessed. They both looked up as I entered, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the smugness in the corners of their eyes. "They were waiting for this." "Emma," my mother said, her voice laced with fake concern. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "My money," I said, letting my voice crack with panic. "It's gone." "My savings account. It's empty. Someone stole it." My father slowly folded his newspaper and placed it on the cushion next to him. He took his time, a little performance of calm authority. He looked at me, his face a mask of condescending pity. "It wasn't stolen, Emma," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "It was reallocated for the good of the family." My mother nodded in agreement, taking a delicate sip of her tea. "It's for Lily's future, sweetie," she said. "She's going to be a doctor. This secures her dream. It's the most important contribution you could ever make." The audacity of it, the sheer, unvarnished confession, left me breathless. They didn't even bother to lie. They were proud of what they had done. My father stood up and walked toward me. He had a look on his face I had seen 1,000 times, the look of a man explaining a simple concept to a child. "We knew you'd be emotional about this," he said. "We knew you wouldn't understand the big picture. You've always been a bit naive, a bit too focused on yourself. Thank you for your naivety, Emma, and thank you for your savings. Your money guarantees Lily's bright future." He patted my shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, but that felt like a brand. They stood there, looking at me, expecting tears, expecting a tantrum, expecting the weak, emotional daughter they had always believed me to be. Instead, I started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a low, cold, humorless laugh that started deep in my chest. It bubbled up past the years of rage and hurt and came out of my mouth, sharp and jarring in the quiet room. They stared at me, their smug expressions faltering, replaced by confusion. My mother lowered her teacup. My father's hand dropped from my shoulder. "What's so funny?" he demanded, his voice losing its smooth edge. I finally stopped laughing and looked at him, my eyes clear and steady. I let the fake panic drain from my face, replacing it with the cold calm I had been holding in for 3 years. I saw their confusion curdle into genuine unease. They were seeing the real me for the very first time, and they didn't know what they were looking at. I took a small, deliberate step back from them. "What's funny?" I said, my voice even and dangerously quiet, "is that you are so arrogant, so blinded by your own greed, that you didn't even consider the possibility that I saw this coming." I let that sink in for a moment. My mother's face went pale. "You think you stole my life savings?" I continued, savoring every word. "You didn't. You just stole a pile of debt and bait money from a decoy account I set up 3 years ago." I smiled then, a real smile this time, and it was the cruelest expression they had ever seen. "You just stole from the wrong account." The silence that followed my words was profound. It was as if a vacuum had sucked all the air and noise from the room. My father's face, which had been a mask of condescending authority just moments before, seemed to collapse inward. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. His skin, usually ruddy with self-satisfaction, took on a grayish, waxy pallor. My mother's reaction was more immediate. The porcelain teacup she was holding slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. It did not shatter. It hit the thick pile of the oriental rug with a dull, muffled thud, spilling a dark stain of Earl Grey tea like a spreading wound. "What? What did you say?" my father stammered. The smooth, confident baritone he used to command our lives was gone, replaced by a thin, reedy whisper. "I believe you heard me," I said, my voice remaining level and calm. This was the moment I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, and I would not let anger or adrenaline ruin it. I was in complete control. I said, "You stole from the wrong account. A decoy, a trap. And you walked right into it." My mother slowly bent down and picked up the teacup, her movements stiff and robotic. "That's not funny, Emma," she said, her voice trembling. "This is a cruel joke. To scare us on your birthday. That's a horrible thing to do." They were grasping for a familiar narrative, one where I was the villain, the cruel and unstable daughter. It was their default setting. A joke? I let out a short, sharp laugh. "You forged my signature? You used my stolen identity? You committed multiple felonies to drain what you thought was my life's work? And you think I'm the one making a joke?" I took out my phone. It felt cool and heavy in my hand, a weapon of my own design. I unlocked it and opened a file. "You see, the difference between you and me is that I prepare. For the last year, I've had a contact, a very helpful fraud investigator I consulted with privately. He's the one who helped me get the necessary alerts put on the account. He was also very helpful in teaching me what kind of evidence the district attorney's office finds most compelling." I turned the phone screen toward them. On it was a beautifully formatted, official-looking document. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Incident Report, pending submission to the district attorney's office." I began to read from it, my voice clear and steady, like a news anchor reporting a tragedy. Victim, Emma Charlotte Reynolds. Suspects, David Allen Reynolds and Susan Marie Reynolds. On the date of October 3rd, the suspects did knowingly and willfully conspire to commit grand larceny, identity theft, and bank fraud against the victim. My father took a stumbling step forward, his hand outstretched as if to grab the phone. "Give me that. This is insane." "You're insane. Am I?" I took a step back, pulling the phone out of his reach. "Perhaps you'd find this less insane." I swiped to a different file and tapped the screen. A video began to play. The quality was perfect. High-definition color with a timestamp in the corner. It was the security footage from the bank's private wealth management office, recorded less than an hour ago. The video showed my father, confident and smiling, sliding a stack of forged documents across a polished mahogany desk to the bank manager. It showed my mother, sitting beside him, looking nervous but resolute, clutching her handbag in her lap. The camera angle was clear enough to see the signature on the withdrawal form, a passable but ultimately fake version of my own. I let the video play. I watched their faces as they watched themselves committing a crime that would send them to prison for years. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, mottled white. The bank manager was informed of a potential fraud attempt on this account weeks ago, I explained calmly, as if describing a scene from a movie. He was instructed to be as helpful and accommodating as possible, to let you complete the transaction, to gather as much clear prosecutable evidence as he could. He did an excellent job, don't you think? He even got you both to smile for the camera. I stopped the video and looked at them. The power dynamic in the room, the one that had governed my entire life, had been completely and irrevocably shattered. I was no longer the powerless child. I was the one holding all the cards. Here's what's going to happen now, I said, laying out the terms of their surrender. You have until noon tomorrow, 21 hours. By that time, the full amount of $2,840,000 needs to be deposited back into that account, not a penny less. If it is, I will consider not pressing send on the email that is currently sitting in my drafts folder, addressed to Assistant District Attorney Miller. My father's blustering rage, his last line of defense, finally kicked in. You wouldn't dare, he roared, his voice cracking. We are your parents. We gave you life. Everything we did was for your sister. You gave me life, and then you turned me into your personal cash machine for a decade. I shot back, my voice finally rising, tinged with the ice of years of suppressed fury. You decided that one child was a person and the other was a commodity. You don't get to claim the title of parents now that you've been caught with your hands in the till. Your love was conditional, and the conditions were my servitude. The terms are no longer acceptable. My mother started to cry then. Not the soft, manipulative tears I was used to, but harsh, ragged sobs of pure terror. Emma, please, she wailed, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. You don't understand. We already gave the money to Lily. We paid the first 4 years of her tuition this afternoon. It was a wire transfer. The school required it up front for international students. So they hadn't even waited a day. The money was already gone, and they had paid for 4 years, not the full 6. The greed and the poor planning were almost comical. That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem, I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. You can call Lily, you can call the school. You can call your investment broker and liquidate your retirement funds. I don't care how you do it, but that money will be back in that account by noon tomorrow. Or your perfect, brilliant Lily can learn to visit you on weekends in a state penitentiary. The threat hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. In a last desperate act of panic, my father pulled out his phone and dialed Lily. He put it on speaker. Lily, it's Dad. We have a problem. A big one. He explained the situation in frantic, disjointed sentences. Lily's voice, when it came through the speaker, was not concerned or scared for them. It was sharp, entitled, and filled with venom directed entirely at me. What do you mean Emma tricked you? She shrieked. Why is she doing this? She's trying to ruin my life. After everything we've done for her. You tell her she has to fix this right now. I'm not giving up my dream because she's having some kind of psychotic breakdown. And that was it. That was the final confirmation. Hearing my sister, the person whose entire life of luxury I had funded, describe my fight for freedom as a psychotic breakdown, severed the last frayed thread of familial obligation in my heart. There was nothing left to save. There was no one here worth protecting. I looked at my parents' horrified faces as they listened to their perfect daughter's selfish rant. I gave them a small pitying smile. Noon tomorrow, I said again, my voice a whisper. Then I turned around, walked up the stairs to my bedroom, the small, cramped room that had been my cell for 30 years, and I locked the door behind me. I sat on my bed and listened to the sounds of their world falling apart. The frantic, panicked phone calls had already begun. The clock was ticking. The night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat in the single, worn armchair in the corner of my room, the one with the faded floral print, and I listened. The walls of our house were thin, and for the first time I was grateful for it. It meant I could hear everything. I was a spectator to the frantic, desperate implosion of my parents' lives. First came the screaming. They yelled at each other, their voices raw with panic and accusation. My father blamed my mother for being too obvious, for leaving a trail. My mother blamed my father for his arrogance, for his belief that I was too stupid to ever see what they were doing. They were like rats trapped in a cage, turning on each other now that the real enemy was out of reach. Then came the phone calls. I heard them on the phone with Lily, a long, tearful, circular argument that went on for over an hour. Lily's shrieks of entitlement and fury were audible even through the floorboards. She wasn't worried about them. She was worried about her tuition, her status, her future. She offered no solutions, only demands that they fix it. After they hung up with Lily, the real work began. I heard my father on the phone with his investment broker. His voice, usually so confident and booming, was strained and pleading. I heard words like liquidate, penalty, and market loss. He was being forced to sell off the stocks and bonds that he had nurtured for decades, the symbols of his success and security. He had to sell them at a loss, in a panic, to get the cash he needed. My mother was on another line, likely with their bank, trying to get a second mortgage on the house. I heard her crying, trying to explain the urgency to a calm, bureaucratic voice on the other end of the line. She had to call their friends, the wealthy couples they socialized with, begging for a short-term loan. I heard the strained, polite refusals. Their social standing, built on a foundation of lies and my stolen labor, was crumbling in a single night. Through it all, I sat in my chair, motionless. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, hollow emptiness. These were the sounds of consequence, the ugly, necessary aftermath of a decade of injustice. It was the sound of a debt being paid. I closed my eyes and imagined myself as a stone at the bottom of a river, letting the chaos of their panic rush over me without moving me. The sun rose the next morning on a house that felt defeated. The yelling had stopped, replaced by a tense, exhausted silence. I unlocked my door and went downstairs. They were both in the kitchen, looking like they had aged 20 years overnight. My father's face was gray and stubbled, his eyes bloodshot. My mother's face was puffy and blotchy from crying. They were hunched over their laptops at the kitchen table, the remnants of their financial empire spread out before them. They didn't look at me as I poured myself a glass of water. They just kept typing, their fingers moving with frantic energy. The morning crawled by, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. The tension in the house was so thick I could taste it. It tasted like fear. At 11:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the deadline, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the BetaCounts bank. Deposit confirmation. A wire transfer of $2,340,000 has been credited to your savings account ending in 4591. They had done it. They had scrambled and begged and sold off pieces of their life, and they had put the money back. My father looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperate hope. "It's there," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "We did it. Now call it off." "You did," I said, looking at my phone. I saw the balance, the beautiful string of numbers. I took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, the final move in the game. They expected me to fold? They thought that getting the money back was my only goal. They still didn't understand me. They still didn't understand justice. I looked them both in the eye. "Thank you for returning the stolen funds," I said, my voice polite and formal. Then I opened the email draft on my phone, the one addressed to Assistant District Attorney Miller, the one with the police report and the video evidence attached. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second. "What are you doing?" my mother whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I pressed send. The little swoosh sound of the email leaving my outbox was the loudest sound I had ever heard. "You promised," my father screamed, slamming his fist on the table. "You said you would consider it. We gave it back." "And I did consider it," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. "I considered the 10 years you stole from me. I considered the car Lily drove while I took the bus. I considered the vacations she took while I worked double shifts. I considered this house, this life, all built on my sacrifice. Returning the money doesn't buy you a get-out-of-jail-free card. You don't get to undo a decade of abuse with a wire transfer. You committed a crime. Multiple crimes. This isn't a negotiation. This is about consequences." The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that echoed through the stunned silence of the house. We all knew who it was. My parents froze, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated horror. I walked to the door and opened it. 2 detectives in plain clothes stood on the porch. A man and a woman. They held up their badges. Behind them, at the curb, were 2 marked police cars, their lights silently flashing. Neighbors were starting to peek out from behind their curtains. "We have a warrant for the arrest of David and Susan Reynolds," the male detective said, his voice calm and professional. I stepped aside and let them in. The scene that followed was surreal. The detectives were quiet and efficient as they explained the charges: grand larceny, fraud, identity theft. My parents were in a state of shock, unable to speak. My mother began to sob uncontrollably as the female detective gently but firmly placed her hands behind her back. I heard the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs, then another click as they cuffed my father. He refused to look at me, his jaw set, his face a thunderous mask of rage and humiliation. They were led out of the house, my mother stumbling, my father walking stiffly. They were placed in the back of separate police cars. I stood in the doorway and watched as the neighbors gathered on their lawns. their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. The cars pulled away from the curb, and a profound silence descended upon the street. The fallout was swift and brutal. The news of their arrest spread like wildfire through our community and family. Later that afternoon, Lily called me. It wasn't a conversation. It was a screaming, hysterical tirade of hatred and blame. While she was on the phone with me, there was a knock at her apartment door. It was the police, there to repossess the brand new BMW my parents had bought her just last week with the initial proceeds of their theft. I heard her shriek, "You can't take my car!" Before the line went dead. My parents had to liquidate everything to pay for their legal defense. They sold the vacation home in the mountains. They drained their remaining retirement accounts. They sold my mother's jewelry. It still wasn't enough. They were ruined, not just financially but socially. Their friends abandoned them. The family was torn apart. It was a complete and total demolition of the life they had built. And it was a foundation I had paid for. Now, they were finally paying the bill. After the police cars disappeared down the street, I closed the front door, and the silence that filled the house was unlike any I had ever known. For 30 years, this house had been filled with a low hum of tension, the unspoken rules, the oppressive weight of my family's expectations. Now that was all gone, but the silence that replaced it wasn't peaceful. Not yet. It was heavy, thick with the ghosts of every sacrifice, every injustice, every lonely night I had spent within those walls. I walked through the rooms, a tourist in the ruins of my former life. I saw the kitchen table, the scene of my financial sentencing. I saw the living room, where they had confessed their crime with smug satisfaction. I saw my father's office, where he had kept the secret file that was supposed to be my undoing. This place wasn't a home. It was a prison, and the wardens had just been taken away. I felt no joy, no sense of victory. I just felt a vast, echoing emptiness. The battle was over, but the war had left me scarred and hollowed out. I knew I couldn't stay there. That night, I packed. It didn't take long. I had very few possessions that held any sentimental value. Most of my clothes were worn-out work uniforms and thrift store finds. I packed a single box of books, my laptop, and the manila folder containing the copies of my identity. I kept it as a reminder, a testament to what I had survived. Everything else, the cheap furniture in my room, the trinkets, the photos, I left behind. They belonged to a person who no longer existed. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I instructed him to handle the sale of the house to pay for my parents' mounting legal fees and restitution. It was the last contribution I would ever make to the family system. Then, I got in my old reliable sedan, the one car that had truly been mine, and I drove away. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I drove for 3 days. I had no destination in mind, only a direction, away. I crossed state lines, watching the landscape change from the familiar green of my home state to the wide-open plains of the Midwest. With every mile I put between me and that house, I felt a layer of grime sloughing off my soul. I stayed in anonymous motels, ate at roadside diners, and spoke to no one. It was a period of decompression, of allowing the profound silence of the road to leach the noise of the past 30 years from my mind. I finally stopped in a small city, hundreds of miles from where I'd started. It was a quiet place with a charming downtown, a river that ran through the center of town, and a sense of peaceful normalcy that I craved more than anything. I spent a week there, living in a hotel, walking through the neighborhoods, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of possibility. It was on one of those walks that I saw it. It was a colonial-style house, set back from the street on a quiet, tree-lined lane. It was painted a soft, buttery yellow with white trim. It had 3 bedrooms, a wide front porch with a swing, and large windows that seemed to drink in the afternoon sunlight. It looked sturdy and peaceful and safe. I called the number on the for sale sign. The next day I toured it. As I walked through the empty rooms, I could feel it. This was the place. This was the quiet apartment I had dreamed of on the day I got my first paycheck, magnified into a home. In the kitchen, the morning light streamed through a large bay window overlooking a backyard filled with overgrown rose bushes. There was a small room off the living room with built-in bookshelves, a perfect library. The silence here was different from the silence in my parents' house. This was a gentle, welcoming silence. It was the sound of peace. The realtor was surprised when I made an offer that afternoon. He was even more surprised when I told him it would be an all-cash offer. I called Ms. Albright, the manager of my trust. For the first time, I made a withdrawal, a very large one. The process was exactly as secure as we had designed. I gave my verbal password, used my security key, and confirmed my identity over the phone. The money, my real money, the money I had earned through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, was transferred to the escrow account. 2 weeks later, the house was mine. I'll never forget the feeling of the keys in my hand. They felt heavy, real. I walked into my empty house, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. I didn't have any furniture, but it didn't matter. I walked into the sun-drenched living room, sat down on the floor, and I cried. I cried for the girl who had her paycheck stolen at 20. I cried for the young woman who worked 3 jobs and never saw the sun. I cried for the daughter who had to destroy her family in order to save herself. It was a storm of grief, a cleansing rain that washed away the last of the bitterness and rage. Rebuilding my life was a quiet, deliberate process. I bought a bed, then a sofa, then a table. I took my time, choosing each piece myself, filling the space with things that brought me comfort and joy. I got a part-time job at the small independent pharmacy in town. The work was less stressful. The customers were friendly, and my boss treated me with respect. I blocked the numbers of my parents, my sister, and every extended family member who had called to scream at me or plead on their behalf. I changed my own number. I cut all ties. One day, out of a sense of detached curiosity, I looked up the results of my parents' court case online. They had pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. They served 18 months in a minimum security prison. Lily had to drop out of her expensive university and get a job. Their world was permanently altered. I felt nothing. Their story was no longer my story. My life became about small, simple pleasures. I adopted a rescue dog, a scruffy terrier mix I named George. I learned to cook, not just for fuel, but for the joy of it. I planted a garden in the backyard. I sat on my porch swing on warm evenings, reading books from my own library, with my dog at my feet. I made my first real friend, a woman from work who invited me over for dinner and never once asked about my past. One sunny afternoon, about a year after I had moved in, I was sitting in my library, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. The house was quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of a ticking clock and my dog snoring softly on his bed. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I thought about who I used to be, the ghost, the servant, the ATM, and I realized she was truly gone. I had fought and I had won. My victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was this. It was the quiet, the sunlight, the freedom. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't a bank, a servant, or a backup plan. I was just Emma. And Emma was finally home. If you've ever been betrayed by the very people who should have protected you, know this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't screaming or fighting. It's patience, planning, and building a life they can't touch. Was I too extreme? Or was I justified? Tell me in the comments what you think. And don't forget, hit like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe justice always finds its way.